Oh wow. Yeah, there's some.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank all of you for joining us tonight. This is America's Future Foundation, and we are a network of conservative and libertarian-leaning young professionals. We try to meet at least once a month and bring in different lecturers, different speakers on different important subjects. Sometimes it's just us sitting around pontificating, because some of us are in the realm where we think we should be allowed to pontificate. And sometimes we bring in some pretty awesome speakers. And one of those awesome speakers is someone we've got coming in now, and that's Jeff Deist from the Mises Institute. So I'm Emil Wilson. I'm one of the board members, and I run a political consulting firm here in town and teach political science in Africa. I first met Jeff because I was getting ready to go spend a chunk of the summer teaching political science in Malawi, and it was very good, very experienced in terms of moral theory. Have a lot of experience in terms of political campaign management, candidacies, things like that. Felt very comfortable on those subjects, but very weak on monetary policy. I told that to a friend of mine who worked on the Hill, and he said, well, there's only one place a conservative should go to learn anything about monetary policy, and that is to the Mises Institute at Auburn. So, went there for the summer to one of their Mises University seminar programs, and Jeff was there. He's the president of the Mises Institute, and he gave one of the more compelling speeches that was a defense of libertarianism and a call for a certain level of sanity and humanity in libertarian voices that when I heard it, I just thought, we got to get this guy in. So we got in touch, and they've had a lot of activities, so he's been a little bit hard to book, but we finally got him, and they're excited. Jeff, before he was president of the Mises Institute, he worked as chief of staff for Rand or Ron?
Ron
Paul, chief of staff for Ron Paul, former congressman that we all love. And then he was a tax attorney. So understands taxation and monetary policy probably better than all of us in here combined. So without further ado, I'd love for us to give a great Mississippi welcome with music in the background to Jeff Deist.
Thank you, Emil. All right, well, thanks very much, Emil, and thank you all for coming out. I found out recently, in just the last week or so, that it's not really possible to fly from Auburn, Alabama to Jackson, Mississippi. So as a result, I drove in a car from Auburn, Alabama to Jackson, Mississippi, and because of that, my wife Paula was willing to come along, so very, very grateful to have her along tonight. It's interesting that we all live in SEC country, and I've only lived there a few years, but it's really grown on me. And it's something I've come to enjoy. It's been one of the real perks about being at the Mises Institute, is being in a smaller town, a very affordable town, a very friendly town, and I think a great town to raise kids. At least it's been that way for us. So I wanted to start out just talking about a conversation I had recently. A good friend of ours from Switzerland named Claudio Gross was in Auburn visiting. Claudio's a hardcore libertarian and a big gold guy. He helps rich people put their physical gold and other physical assets in storage vaults in Switzerland, where they're totally outside the banking system. So you get a sense of what kind of guy he is. And so we were talking about the Swiss federalist system, the system of subsidiarity. And it started to dawn on me more and more as I spoke to him, something that I already knew and that we all already know instinctively, but we don't always know clearly, and that is that as we try to persuade people and as we try to win hearts and minds, it's easier if we do that with fewer people, right? We're always wondering, what's the best way to spread liberty? What's the best strategy for libertarianism? Well, maybe it's smaller political subdivisions as opposed to trying to win over these big countries like America with 320 million people. And so after talking to Claudio, I took some time on the Swiss government's website. And that's one of the handouts here on Swiss federalism. And it's just unbelievable because our Constitution gives lip service to federalism. It wasn't followed for very long. Well, it really only followed for a few decades. But what really struck me about the Swiss government's website was the humility of this website. There's so much hubris in American politics. We expect these national politicians to have the answer for everything under the sun. And so you're reading this website and you realize how humble it is. It says, well, basically anything can be done at the local level. We don't touch, and we push all decision making down, and the principle of subsidiarity is what governs us. And I was thinking, can you imagine hearing Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump last year on the campaign trail in Jackson, Mississippi, or in Anchorage, or in Miami, or any place saying, it's great. Thank you all for being here tonight. I don't really know Anchorage or Jackson. So what we're going to do is we're going to let you guys decide that to the extent possible. So knock yourselves out, and thanks very much. This is just unthinkable in American politics. We expect our federal politicians to be these omnipotent masters of health care and budgets and taxes and environmentalism and global warming. And it's just an absurd system when you've got 320 million people. But what I really liked about this handout on the Swiss government's website was this clause here in a sentence that says, federalism makes an important contribution to social cohesion. I was thinking about that, and I thought, God, we could use some of that in the United States right now. I mean, we're so divided politically, and there was so much nastiness really following the rise of Trump and then the entire unbearable 2016 campaign, and then now since Trump's elected. And I think we could actually learn quite a bit from the Swiss when it comes to social cohesion. And maybe the number one lesson we could learn from them is that smaller is better. And that's not only true politically, but also in terms of social cohesion and peace. And that's something that's really struck me, and it's something I think we don't think about enough as libertarians. So there's this unpleasant undercurrent to American politics, especially since Trump won the election. And there's actually people on both on the left and the right talking seriously about using the word civil war and using the term secession. And these aren't just people on the extreme fringes saying these kinds of things. Even people who are more mainstream conservatives and liberals. The one article I would recommend to you is from a guy named Angelo Codevilla. And he wrote an article in the Claremont Review of Books called The Cold Civil War. Now, he's not a crazy guy or an outlandish guy. He's what I would call a doctrinaire conservative. On the left, there was a seminal article in the New Republic called Blue Exit. I don't know if you heard about this. It came out in March of 2017. It was very strong, just saying, look, these red states are crazy. It's time for us to turn our backs on them. It's time for us to go our separate ways. And this is the New Republic. This isn't some radical part of the left, but really a mainstream part of it. And of course, since Trump won, our friends on the left have discovered federalism and states' rights in spades, and they're talking about sanctuary cities and this kind of thing. So let me give you a quote from this gentleman in the New Republic. He says, "We won't formally secede in the Civil War sense of the word. We'll still be a part of the United States, at least on paper, but we'll turn our back on the federal government in every way we can, just like you've been urging everyone to do for years, and devote our hard-earned resources to building up our own cities and states." And I thought to myself, if that's a threat, I'll take it. It sounds a lot like Switzerland, as a matter of fact. So I thought I would pose to you guys a little bit of a thought experiment. I don't know how familiar any of you are with the San Francisco Bay Area. But I've lived there myself. My wife has lived there. When we were first dating, we lived there, and we've actually lived there in 2 different times. So the San Francisco Bay Area is made up of about 8 million folks in about 9 counties. And these are some of the bluest counties in the country. They reliably vote 80 or 90% for Democrats, and not just Democrats, but Pelosi-type Democrats. Very left-wing in outlook. So imagine if we allowed those 9 counties right here, right now, a wide degree of localism and subsidiarity like the Swiss system. Imagine if those counties could decide right here, right now, without needing any federal governance, without needing any federal laws, to have the whole panoply of what most people on the left want right now, which would be climate change regulations, progressive taxation, maybe limits on income, some kind of universal health care system within those 9 counties, maybe very strict regulations or even prohibitions on firearms, free public housing, free public education, make Cal Berkeley free. Would anyone in this room really object to this? Now, we might say, that's not going to work because, for instance, free public health care carries all the wrong incentives for people to overconsume and underpay, and that there's no rational price mechanism. Same thing for education, etc. So we might say that technically that's not going to work, or pragmatically that's not going to work. But would anyone in this room object to them trying it or having it for themselves? And my answer is absolutely no. And I don't like this idea that people in the San Francisco Bay Area have to fear the election of some, what they consider redneck senator from some southern state, like this guy we're apparently going to elect in Alabama. The former Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore. I mean, people in blue states and blue cities, actually, that causes them fear and apprehension. What kind of system is this for 320 million people where you have to worry about some state 2,000 or 3,000 miles away electing someone? And really, at the end of the day, Americans are governed by about 535 knuckleheads in Washington, D.C., and about 9 Supreme Court justices. If you go back to colonial times and the number of U.S. representatives and extrapolate forward to modern day, there should be about 10,000 members of Congress. Unless you're really out in a rural area, your member of Congress should live within a mile or so of you. You should see him or her at the grocery store. They should kind of know you, and they should kind of a little bit fear you in terms of having to see you after casting some vote. But the system we have now, every member of Congress has about 700,000 constituents. It's not working. And I think the Swiss system works a lot better. So let's think about this in terms of what we see happening right now in Catalonia. This is a very serious situation where the central Spanish government has federal police. And they're sending those federal police in violently to suppress elections, to tear down polling stations, to seize ballot boxes, this kind of thing. This is really pretty unprecedented. I happen to know a fair number of libertarians who live in Europe, and I also know 3 or 4 really dedicated Spanish libertarians. And they're even split on this. Some are like, no, Jeff, you're all wrong. The people behind this are left-wing, and they want to have a real sort of communist Catalonia. They want to be really aligned with the EU. They're socialist in mindset, and people are going to have less freedom. So this isn't libertarian. This result is not, there's nothing libertarian about this, and you're out to lunch. And then there's other Spanish libertarians I've talked to who said, no, you know what? I'm in Madrid, let them go. I can live with this. But what I'd like to suggest is that there's a difference between the principle of secession and the question of whether secession in any given circumstance is a good idea. Right? It's 2 different things. One's a principle, one's sort of a factual question. But Catalonia is not some backwater. This isn't some economically depressed part of Europe or part of Spain. This is an economically vibrant region that also happens to contain the city of Barcelona, which is one of the great capitals of Europe, if not the world. So this isn't an academic question. Now, it's not up to us. It's not up to us as Americans and non-interventionists to decide for them. But I think we should embrace the idea that smaller is better when it comes to governments and political arrangements. I think any time a central government gives up power and turf, whether that's over the number of human bodies they profess to govern or the number of kilometers or miles that it holds sway over, I think that's a good thing. And I think the proof of this is in the pudding, because central governments in Madrid, in Brussels, the EU, in Washington, D.C., they resist it so mightily. And whenever I see central governments resisting something with all their might, it leads me to believe that it's probably a good thing. At some point, I would imagine most of us in this room would say we ought to have 7.5 billion self-governing autonomous humans on Earth. Right now we have about 195 countries. At some point we got to have 196. At some point we got to have 200. At some point we got to have 300. We're a long way from 7.5 billion. But I personally think that we ought to be supporting the principle of subsidiary and secession, whether or not the facts on the ground, the history, the ethnography, the language, whatever it might be, argues for or against Catalonia and the outcome there. So, as libertarians, our response to this nasty politicization of society that we really saw ramped up in 2016 is to make politics matter less. Correct? We do this by making government matter less, by making government less powerful and thus less fearsome, and lowering the political stakes and the political rhetoric and the political hatred. We want to create a system where people in the San Francisco Bay Area don't have to fear some redneck senator from Alabama. But how we do this, how we get from A to B, it's been a tough question for libertarians. I'm sure Rand didn't do as well as most of us might thought he was going to do in New Hampshire or otherwise, in Iowa. Gary Johnson didn't do very well as a libertarian candidate, ended up not getting into the debates. But there's more to it than that. We've become obsessed as libertarians or as liberty-minded people with this idea of national politics and figuring out how to create some 51% electoral majority to change society. And in the current reality, that comes out to about 65 million people. That's a lot of hearts and minds. And I think because of this, we've lost sight of what's really this undercurrent, the dominant trend of our age, which is radically decentralized systems. And as I mentioned, I think for libertarians, smaller is better. And I think for progressives and conservatives, smaller is better too. This isn't a zero-sum fight that we have to engage in necessarily. And as a matter of fact, I think we ought to be doing the opposite. We ought to be looking at win-win solutions. So, if we think about the last two big revolutions in society, the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, these are actually somewhat centralizing in effect. Agriculture caused people to stop being nomadic, to get food and come together on the farms and to work in agricultural concerns. The Industrial Revolution took people out of rural areas and brought them into cities and big firms and big factories like General Motors, and brought them together geographically into cities. So those were both centralizing revolutions. But the digital revolution, the revolution that we might say started, you could say it started in the 70s, but I think it really got going in force in the 1990s. The digital revolution decentralizes us. It moves the world in the other direction. And really every aspect of human life that we can think of is becoming decentralized. Commerce, think of firms like Amazon all over the world. Business hierarchies are becoming flatter and decentralized. IT, not only information technology, but the spread, the dissemination of information itself. Money and banking becoming highly decentralized. Even group affiliations and loyalties are becoming decentralized, because if you have a particular interest or a particular hobby or a particular desire or love, you can connect now with people all over the world. You're not just limited to the libertarians who might be in your town, or to the people who like your hobby who might be in your town, or you're looking to buy a used car. You're no longer just stuck with the used cars in your town. You've got the internet. And this has really been the trend of our times. I mean, you go to the what do you call it, the freestyle machine at the fast food place. You've got 150 different combinations of soda. It's just unbelievable. So if we think of information as the new product of the digital age, then it's increasingly dispersed. So this revolution is a little bit different. The digital age not only does it disperse us, but it changes the way organizations work, and that includes government. You think of decentralized networks like Google or Amazon, and then you think of the old hub and spoke models that was particularly of governments and empires. Think of the British Empire and India and all of its colonies. Whereas today we think of servers and information and networks are kind of more clusters of lights or almost like spider webs. They're more like Hulu or Netflix as opposed to the big three networks that we all remember from our childhood, and they're kind of static programming. So why is Google Google? At least in terms of its management style. Well, because it uses flat management. It has decentralized teams that work on things. And companies that do that, at least at the moment, are prospering, and companies that are old line in their thinking, like we might look at GM that had to be bailed out, or we might look at IBM, which has lost the luster it had in our parents' and grandparents' age. Google's Google because it uses decentralized management. So the digital age, if I had to put it into one word, is the age of disintermediaries, right? Both human and technological. A disintermediary is anything or anyone that eliminates the middleman being the intermediary in a process. So this is really the central theme of the digital age. So that's why we now have peer-to-peer transactions like Uber. There's no dispatcher, there's no taxi company per se. We have Bitcoin, which doesn't require a central bank or a state propping up a central bank. Google is sort of an intermediary. We're finding out some more and more bad things about Google, but still, there's no library involved. There's no professor standing between you and all the information at your fingertips on your phone or whatever via Google. So now, without any real intermediary, we have access to almost all the world's accumulated knowledge in a little device in our pockets. It's amazing if you think about it. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is decentralization at work. So if we think about the Catalan people who are marching in the streets right now, they view the Madrid government as an unnecessary intermediary that they need to eliminate. And secession for them is the process of disintermediation. So at least until they replace the devil they know maybe in Madrid with the devil they don't know in Brussels. But in the midst of all this change, of all this decentralization, only one part of human life's going the other direction: governance. I mean, it's almost unbelievable when you think about it that we allow this. Only governments are becoming more hierarchical and more bureaucratic. We think in the United States, the trend over the last 100 years has been to federalize more and more of what used to be done at the state and local level. We think of Europe, what used to be done in national or regional countries is now done at Brussels, under the European Union, or it's done in Frankfurt in the European Central Bank as opposed to independent central banks. We see this centralization in all areas of government, even in quasi-government organizations like the United Nations, like the International Monetary Fund. These are not only centralizing federally in a certain country, they're actually centralizing supranationally amongst different, or I should say supranationally, across different countries. So globalism is the order of the day for governments. And why on earth should libertarians support this? I don't know if any of you read Michael Malice or know who he is. He appears on Fox News sometimes. And he wrote an article the other day. He says only politics remains binary. So with politics, it's always either or, it's always zero sum, and it's always win-lose. And we don't accept this in the marketplace. It's amazing that we accept it in government. So I want to make a distinction, though. When the political class talks about globalism as a good thing, what they mean is political globalism. And this is what I would consider illiberal doctrine, that what's good for X politically is necessarily good for Y. And it's always, you notice, a world run by people just like them. It's never about you. And what they mean by globalism is sameness. They mean universal political arrangements that are all going to culminate in what they see as kind of an approved social democracy model with only nominal national sovereignty and diminishing national sovereignty. But the problem with this is that political globalism is actually quite illiberal, and it can even veer towards authoritarianism because it reduces the ability of the average person to have a say in how they're governed. Political matters increasingly are decided someplace far away. It's the opposite of Uber and Bitcoin and Google. So if somebody in Jackson is trying to fight a fight with the city council, fighting that fight at the city level versus the state level versus the federal level becomes harder and harder. What happens when they have to fight something at the international level? Is their voice stronger? No, it's clearly weaker. So in the sense of political globalism, I would argue that it's illiberal and it's something we ought to oppose. Now this form of globalism is not at all what Ludwig von Mises meant by globalism. When he talks about it, he saw it as this economic phenomenon that actually emphasizes the differences between places, not the sameness. The differences expressed in the division of labor, in specialization, and comparative advantage between places. If China can make a t-shirt for $5 and get it to Walmart, let them do it. We don't need to create a $10 t-shirt in America just because. I mean, this is what Mises meant by globalism, was trade, and trade is based on differences, different comparative advantages between countries and people, because if we're all the same, then we'd have no reason to trade with each other. We all have the same goods and services, the same expertise. So Mises saw the right to self-determination as the highest political value, which if we allowed it to happen, if we allowed the world to express itself the way the Swiss allows its cantons to express themselves, what we'd have is real diversity, not this phony baloney diversity that they talk about in terms of globalism. So if we, the people in this room, if we think that people should be free as individuals to make their own choices, even choices we might think are bad, then they must also be free to do so as groups. I think it is consistent to argue, and that extends to places like Catalonia. So again, we're talking about political globalism. I'm not worried about globalism that arises through the marketplace, whether it's economic or cultural or social. To the extent these things represent market preferences, to the extent the world just says, hey, certain things really are better. We all like Diet Coke. We all like Honda Accords. That's fine. But when these preferences are sort of instilled or installed in countries by nefarious mechanisms like NGOs, then I think we have a real cause for concern. So, talking to Emil earlier and knowing what I've known over the years about AFF, for those of you who are familiar, actually has a beautiful building, a townhouse that they own in DuPont Circle area of DC where they hold events. Presumably the reason you're involved with AFF is because you care about creating a more libertarian and more prosperous society. But we've all struggled, I think, with the question of what's the best strategy, what's the best tactical approach to go about this. And if the answer to this was crystal clear, we'd presumably all be doing it. But there's always costs involved. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the great Thomas Sowell. When people ask him a question, he always says, well, compared to what? That's always the question, not just for us, but for our opponents. There's always questions that we always have to think about choices and costs involved and respond to this sort of utopia trap that we sometimes find ourselves in when people are questioning libertarianism. So we can boil it down, I think, to really two basic choices. There's a great book written in 1970 by a sociologist and social theorist named Albert Hirschman. It's called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Little thin book, about 180 pages. I'm curious if anyone's ever heard of it. It's one of those sleeper books. I really recommend. It's a little dry, but it holds up really well. That's 45, 50 years now. 1970, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty by a guy named Albert Hirschman. So the theme of the book is that all organizations, including governments, tend to deteriorate over time. That their product or their service gets worse. And this of course, tends to make customers unhappy or citizens unhappy, which leaves them, like it leaves us, with two basic choices, which are voice and exit. Either change things to make them better or leave them. So we voice our displeasure or we exit and switch to a competitor to the extent that's possible. But loyalty tends to slow this process down. Loyalty to the brand, to the monarch in previous centuries, to the state, it tends to postpone our willingness to exit. It's a form of political inertia. But on the other hand, the idea that we have a voice, or the possibility that we have a voice to change things, the possibility of exiting makes our voice more important. So these two things kind of work in tandem, voice and exit. We all understand this with consumer products. We like to think that we have choices, but governments, for an awfully long time, have gotten away with murder, both literally and figuratively, because they've only given lip service to voice, while exit which means expatriating, leaving the country, historically has been very difficult for all but the most wealthy people in any given society. But I think the digital age, the decentralized age, stands to change this profoundly, and I'm optimistic about that. I'm encouraged about that. So, within this framework of voice and exit, I'll leave you with sort of the three choices we might have, or three very basic choices of how we might go about making things better for ourselves. And the first, of course, is politics. And I understand we all have felt the desire to scratch this itch. And the thing about engaging in politics is it gives you something tangible. There's a filing deadline, there's fundraising, there's a primary, there's election. You go work for Rand Paul in his campaign, that you have sort of tangible primaries and tangible vote totals and these things, whereas just promoting liberty in other ways has a sort of vague and unsatisfactory feel to it. But the thing about politics is they're really, really difficult. As you all know, the odds are stacked against us in a million different ways, not only in what's a damnably difficult two-party system, but also in the money game and just the situation in Washington. I mean, when I worked for Ron Paul, he basically used this seat as an educational tool. But when it comes to really getting bills passed or preventing bills from getting passed, we send some good people to Washington like Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, but it's a very difficult environment. And you have to remind yourself that we've had a century of progressive victories. That's the baseline in which we operate. The progressives won the 20th century. They won central banking, they won social insurance, they won the welfare state, they won the interventionist military state. And by progressives, I don't necessarily mean left, I mean left and right progressives, people who want an activist government. And so that leaves us now, 100 years later, where the debate is always framed as what should government do about X? So when that's the question, liberty-minded people are already on their heels because we don't accept that framework. Our question is, should government even be involved in X? So we shouldn't kid ourselves about how difficult the political environment really is, at least at the national level. So the second approach that a lot of us use, is certainly the one the Mises Institute has chosen to use, is education, winning hearts and minds. Now this is a little less tangible, it's a little more vague than engaging in politics and having races, but a lot of people would argue that this is really what matters, that politics is downstream from culture anyway, so you might as well roll up your sleeves and get to work. It's a long game. It's not necessarily for people in a hurry. And there's really two ways to view the education game, top-down or bottom-up. The top-down approach was promoted by Friedrich Hayek, who said, well, here's what we ought to do. We ought to get liberty-minded scholars ought to invade academia and start to win over academics to our point of view. And those academics will set the stage and create the ideas for a media class below them to disseminate information to the masses. So it's kind of a top-down approach. And if we look at academia in the 20th century and now 21st, I don't think it's working. There's a flaw in Hayek's thinking, and that is that academics have self-interest too, just like the rest of us. And for most of them, the system works, and they have an interest, a self-interest in perpetuating it, writing these dopey academic papers that nobody reads, but that's how you get tenure, that's how you advance, that's how you become a department chair. And they're kind of comfortable. It's a pretty good gig if you can get tenure. So the top-down approach hasn't worked so well. Murray Rothbard argued for a bottom-up approach. He said, hey, let's not be afraid as libertarians to be populist in our thinking. And that rubs a lot of people the wrong way because we like to think of ourselves as more of an intellectual movement and a movement that's based on ideas. But if we think about it, populism isn't an ideology per se. Populism is a tactic. You can imbue populism with whatever you want. And I would argue that Ron Paul used populism very skillfully in two different senses. One, he said, get out of Iraq. Get out of the Middle East. Now that's a populist message that resonated with people who were sick of these wars, who didn't see an American interest in them anymore, and saw the amount of money and the amount of carnage we were spending. So that was certainly a populist message. The other populist message he used to great effect was end the Fed. That's not complicated. That appeals to the average person.
Simple message.
I mean, does the average guy or gal understand the mechanics of how the Fed operates and how it enriches certain people at the expense of others? Well, probably not, but since when is that a crime? I mean, most monetary economists can't explain to you the mechanics of how the Fed operates. So, you know, simplifying things and approaching the masses and using populism, I think, can be a great approach. Just think of it this way: when elites get that way, when elites become elites because they're state connected, then being anti-elite is a-okay, right? Think of pharmaceutical cartels. Think of AIG and the bailouts it had as a monster insurance company after the '08 crash. Think about Wall Street bonuses that are based on phony baloney equity market prices. Or just think of equity markets in general and crazy real estate spikes in places like Manhattan and San Francisco. I would argue that we ought to be a little more open to a common touch and to a populist argument within the parameters of what we know to be right. So we've got politics, we've got winning hearts and minds, and then we've got the third approach, which is secession, decentralization, subsidiary, localism, nullification, basically trying by hook or by crook to apply a Swiss model to our lives. So this we would call exit as opposed to voice. Now exit can take a lot of different forms. It doesn't necessarily mean in the digital age that people have to physically segregate themselves. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to have a violent conflict or a secessionist movement, or that a certain region of the United States has to break off from the rest. I mean, there's a lot of ways short of that I think people can secede digitally. Just like you and your neighbor don't have to have the same cable package or the same cell phone provider. It's not that hard to imagine a world 20 or 30 or 50 years from now where you and your neighbor have one of you opts into Social Security and one of you opts out. One of you opts into Medicare and one of you opts out. There's a million permutations that we could think of for this, but I think that at some point we have to recognize that walking away from Washington, D.C., literally or figuratively, might be more attractive to us than trying to win over that 51% electorate, also known as 65 million people. So in closing, this is what conservatives and progressives spent the 20th century arguing about: political universalism. Even libertarians spent the 20th century, to the extent they had a voice, arguing for universal political principles. We all believe in universal principles of self-ownership, private property, basic individual sanctity, but political universalism is a different can of worms. And what we're finding in the 21st century is that what we imagine to be universal norms and attitudes are not as widely agreed upon as we might think. And in a hyper-connected digital age, I think elites are going to find it increasingly difficult to make the case for globalism against this tide of secessionist movements, breakaway movements, populist movements. And I think libertarians should embrace this. I think they should embrace this reality and reject political universalism for not only a tactically superior and more palatable vision, but maybe even a morally more palatable vision of radical self-determination. So with that, I'll have Emil open up to some questions. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us.
Did everybody get the little survey?
Oh, there's a survey.
Yeah, there's a survey as well.
Yeah, I got my survey.
We'll get that passed around.
Yeah, there's some,
again,
and
because
there's some pens.
this time there's actual audio. I'm Emil Wilson, and I'm on the board for America's Future Foundation here in Jackson. And Jeff would love some interaction and some questions and answers, and wants it to be actual interaction. So I'm going to kick it off with a question.
Okay.
We talk about self-determination, and if we use libertarianism and localism as a guiding moral principle, then we're talking about individual self-determination as well as localized self-determination. At what point does a moral compulsion exist on the libertarian side to intervene on behalf of an oppressed minority in a place like communist Catalonia, Islamic Iran, or even somewhere as severe as Berkeley?
Well, maybe we should take the most severe case perhaps on earth, which is North Korea. I don't know if any of you read Michael Malice's book.
Just make sure that's turned.
Which is an amazing book. North Korea to this day has concentration camps. They call them realignment centers, or they have some euphemism for them. And if you read, especially the end of that book, boy, I'll tell you what, you want to talk about a moral quandary for libertarians who say, well, I'm a non-interventionist, we should never intervene militarily anywhere in the world unless there's a direct American interest, and some sort of humanitarian crisis isn't enough. I don't have the answer other than all I would say is it's never okay to argue for sending humans into harm's way where they might be hurt or they might hurt other people unless you're willing to send yourself or your own kids if you're older. So I look at it, would I give up my job and just leave and give up my paycheck, and maybe I get some army paycheck, I don't know, and go to Korea and fight against the North Koreans? Or would I send my son to do that? If the answer to those questions is no, then I don't think I can send some anonymous young kid in the U.S. Army to do it in my stead. I think most of us, in fact, I would say probably think all of us, if somehow Chinese gunships came up into the Gulf of Mexico here and started lobbing cruise missiles into the Florida Panhandle and the Gulf Coast, I think most of us would leave our jobs and go down there and fight because it's a little close to home. And is that a human frailty or a moral failing that we care more about something close to home than we do something not only far away geographically but conceptually in North Korea? I guess it is a human failing and a human frailty. We're imperfect creatures, and any governance or system we create is going to reflect that imperfection. So. But as libertarians, we have to push back when we get these utopia questions, don't we? It's like, well, what's the left-wing answer? What's the right-wing answer? It ain't any better. I assure you of that. And the best answer in almost every instance is close to the ground, local. So if anyone's going to rescue the North Koreans from this unbelievable stuff, I'd like to see it be the South Koreans first and foremost. Maybe see that country unified, whatever it might be. But I mean, let me put it this way: I would be more inclined to go to North Korea personally than I would to have gone into Iraq in 2002 and upset what Saddam Hussein had cobbled together between three nations, and was at least keeping somewhat peaceful. So, if I wouldn't go myself or send my kid, then I say I can't argue for anyone else to go.
Yes, ma'am.
To shift the whole conversation, I feel like the entire world is really driven by monetary policy. So our policies and the way we're connected with central banking and the way that we no longer control exactly the value of our dollar. What are your thoughts on how the libertarian movement can do to actually change the whole conversation?
Right.
People have totally distorted and they don't understand monetary policy and how it impacts them every single day.
Right.
Well, it impacts the whole world because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. I mean, we've never. If you look at history, you look at Argentina in the late '90s. You look at Zimbabwe, the former Rhodesia. If you look at obviously Weimar Germany, all those currencies blew up. But the damage was contained regionally because that's where they were used. So there's no historical precedent for a world's reserve currency going boom. And there's a couple reasons why we are still the world's reserve currency. One is because for the most part, at least in OPEC nations, still buy oil. They still have to use dollars to buy oil.
That's gonna change.
That and some people say that's part of our saber rattling against Iran because they wanted to create an oil bourse that wasn't priced, that was priced in euro rather than dollar. And the second is the implicit backing of the U.S. military and all of our nuclear arsenal, which remains the biggest, baddest on earth. So, that can go on an awfully long time. And the thing about currencies is that it's all relative. Which is the least dirty shirt in the laundry? And for now, that's the dollar. And what I would say is that we're in a bizarre period where the rest of the world, China, India, Russia, they all know that that it's not in their long-term interest to maintain the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. But they all have so damn many of them that it's also not in their short-term interest to just dump them all and have other people get scared and follow suit and have the dollar decline precipitously and be the person in musical chairs who's left, especially Asian central banks, with a bunch of dollars or dollar-denominated treasuries or whatever it might be. So it's bizarre because it's not in the world's short-term interest to have the dollar go down, but it is in the world's long-term interest to have the dollar go down. So you're gonna have to ask somebody. You're gonna have to ask somebody smarter than me to tell you how that plays out.
Let me follow up with that on that question, and maybe this is another one you can punt.
Sorry,
okay. But the talk is often, especially out of scholars from the Mises Institute, about a gold standard or even a gold and silver standard. In today's modern currency, I'd rather have a lot of oil than a lot of gold in many ways, whether it's a natural disaster or simple trade. There are values in other commodities. What should we be looking towards as a commodity-based monetary system? Or should we be looking at a commodity-based system versus a simple, structured, and defined system? I mean, even to a certain extent, gold could be a fiat currency in that regard. So what should we be looking towards in monetary policy as a basis for the dollar and other trade?
I think a good currency would be private. I think it would be backed by whatever the market demands, which might be a mix of things to diversify and reduce risk. I'm sure gold and silver would play a part in that, but other commodities might play a part. And oil is pretty volatile. I don't know, but I think it could exist in a crypto form and be accounted for on a distributed ledger system, not necessarily Bitcoin, but some system. Some people argue that the actual technology behind Bitcoin is in itself its own commodity value. I'm not 100% sure that I agree with that, but there's no reason you couldn't have a basket of commodities that forms the basis for a crypto currency. But as long as it's under the control of a government or a central bank that's under the control of a government, the political influence is always there.
What's cryptocurrency, real quick? What's cryptocurrency?
Cryptocurrency is just an electronic method of payment, like Bitcoin.
Oh, okay.
Cryptocurrency
Is a digital or electronic method of payment, like Bitcoin, that is accounted for on an electronic ledger system. In other words, it exists in cyberspace only, but on a bunch of different servers. It's not controlled on any one server. So the record of it, there's sort of a group record of transactions, which eliminates some of the distrust. So there's no central bank involved, and there's no national government involved.
TJ.
Yeah, I would definitely like to talk more about your ideas of the United States on the international stage, but I want to bring it back to kind of a theme that you had over the course of the night, and that was keeping things local and the movement at a local level. I know that I have the field that I work in, my counterparts do a lot at the city level and a lot at the supervisor level. And even in Mississippi, our government is really set up where a lot of power lies within the Board of Supervisors at the state level. How are you telling people to engage their local governments at that level in this movement when you're talking about thinking local?
Right. Well, this is where I think if the Libertarian Party had started out from the get-go as a state and local party, it might have done a lot better because oftentimes in local elections, like your county supervisor or something, you can win that election with 5, 10, 20,000 votes. And if you're spending $3 per vote, that's actually doable. Whereas you want to go run for U.S. Congress, a district of 700,000 people, you're probably going to need at least 150,000 votes. So the financing of that becomes a lot tougher. One big problem in America versus Switzerland for doing the kind of things locally you want to do is that in Switzerland, things are flipped. Usually about 80% of your taxes, income taxes, go to your canton, and only about 20% to the Swiss federal government. So it's kind of the opposite in the United States. We usually send about 80% or more to the feds. So that's a real problem because so much funding comes from the federal government as a result of that. So all these states and municipalities become these little beggars. They become glorified counties of the federal government, which is really sickening if you think about it, because talk about an intermediary. My God. I mean, 70 cents of every dollar spent to Washington, depending on whose numbers you believe. I think roughly 70 cents of every dollar is consumed by the federal bureaucracy. It's really an astonishing crime. But the flip side of that is that despite all the money that goes to Washington, the actual manpower of Washington is pretty small. I mean, you take away the armed forces, which could become a factor. The total number of federal employees is quite small relative to the 300. It's like a couple million people. So look at medical marijuana. This isn't a case where the feds said, "Okay, we give up. You guys do what you want." That's not it at all. These states just said, "We can't do this anymore. We can't afford to have our cops pulling people over and putting people in jail for having a couple little, leftover joints in their ashtray. It costs too much money. It requires too much police services. We're going to start doing stuff at the state level." Now, there's all kinds of federal laws that preempt this, but Obama, to his credit, did not send in the federales and say, no, we're going to go in and we're going to send in federal agents and bust up your dispensary in Oakland. They didn't do that. So the states just kind of shrugged. And they just kind of said, we're going to disregard federal law and we're going to have a little bit of what we call Irish democracy. And we're just going to do this. And they just did it. And it's unbelievably successful. I think there are 7 states now that have active medical marijuana. Uber, for a long time, Uber was operating in a gray area in cities all across America. They had some lawyers and they had some investors who had some guts. I'll give them that much, because that must have been a scary thing to say, to be investing all this money in a system where some big city like New York could say, we're banning this. But it was so much better. If you're in the suburbs, you can't get a taxi. Taxis work in really dense urban areas like Manhattan, where people are just everywhere needing one and you just see one. But if you're out at a bar in the suburbs, and if any of you has ever called a taxi to pick you up to go to the airport the next morning, you're just terrified that the thing's not going to show up, and half the time it doesn't. It doesn't work. And so Uber comes along and says, hey, look, we can have the system where you know where the thing is, you know how long it's going to be, you know the price ahead of time. And not only that, you can rate the driver and the driver can rate you. So all this BS about, well, it's unregulated and we don't know if the cars are going to be safe. Have you ever been in a New York City taxi? I mean, where the driver was a lunatic and the cab was falling apart? Yes, you have. So it was just so superior that it's almost that it couldn't be suppressed. And I think medical marijuana is just one of those things where the states just couldn't keep apprehending and paying to incarcerate people for having this stupid leaf that grows in the ground in their possession. So, I mean, it's a mixed bag, but these are the kind of things that encourage me, and you can do a lot in your town.
But yet there are so many governments that are now upset because of that, because they made tax dollars off seizure laws. And so now we have Sessions out there going in and reinstituting, putting seizure laws back in place, and taking things from people before they even got guilty.
Well, the shocking statistic is that 80% of Mexican drug cartel money comes from pot. Not heroin, not crack, not any kind of what we think of as nasty street drugs, just garden variety potheads account for 80% of Mexican drug cartels' income. So at some point, you know, I hope that medical marijuana is the crack in the dam. But Sessions is
Crack cocaine!
Yeah.
I mean, that could be your bottom
Oh, I'm
up
sorry.
campaign. It's
Maybe
like,
a little too early.
focusing on that.
We're next door.
Absolutely.
Yes, go ahead.
On the survey, you have a section on there for the Benedict option.
Yes.
What role does that play? And also, is that a reference to Rod Dreher's book?
It is. There's an insufferable blowhard named Rod Dreher who writes ad nauseum at a website called The American Conservative. And if there's ever been a human being who likes the sound of their own voice more than this guy, I haven't met him. But sorry if he's a friend. I shouldn't be.
No, I agree with you.
But he basically is an uber Catholic who left the Catholic Church because it wasn't to become an Orthodox, because I guess the Catholic Church was failing him, and he came up with this concept he didn't, but the Benedict option, which refers to the notion in Catholicism of sort of withdrawing, retreating from the society because it's so lost from a Catholic moral or ethical perspective. And you know, there are examples of this. Murray Rothbard used to say, look, I don't want to go live on some island. You know, I don't want to retreat from society. And some of you might know John Waters, the filmmaker from Baltimore, who created Pink Flamingos and some other kind of avant-garde black comedies. So John Waters says, isolation is for losers, and you got to engage the culture as it is. And I guess I somewhat agree with that. But there are certainly people who have done this successfully. I mean, look at the Amish. You got to hand it to them. Not the way I would want to live, but the federal government's pretty much left them alone. And I don't think the wider culture views the Amish as with hostility. I don't think the left views the Amish with hostility. I think most people just say, well, Amish and Quakers have their thing. So that's kind of an example in society.
And that explains why I don't often wear my "Who is John Galt" pin. Occasionally.
Okay.
Yes.
Quick question about strategy and supporting the policy publicly, especially because I do a radio show every Thursday morning, and we end up talking about most of the time critically examining whatever policy Trump or Congress or whoever is evaluating at the time. So I end up having to, by circumstance, take a position most of the time on a lot of public policy issues. The way I usually judge these things is to try to examine as much as possible, given the context. Does this, in aggregate effect, increase the size, scope, or depth of government interference? Or does it decrease on aggregate the size, scope, and depth of government interference? Which is, for now at least, the best heuristic I can come up with for judging public policy in the paradigm that we have. So taking that, and taking your point as well about the evils of political globalism, with which I wholeheartedly agree, how do we judge movements towards stuff like the TPP or Brexit when it's really hard to tell if on net, because both sides of the Brexit debate, for instance, were claiming that the EU would decrease trade restrictions, versus the British were claiming, which I think is the truth, that exiting the EU would decrease all the restrictions on trade. So how do we judge with these international organizations like this on net if it decreases or increases government involvement, or do you just say when it's that close of a call, I'm kind of agnostic about it, there's too much government involvement generally anyway?
I think you got to understand the optics. I think every libertarian should have been totally pro-Brexit.
Right.
I think we should have been shouting it to the roof.
Pro-Brexit?
Absolutely. I think we should have been shouting it from the rooftops. I mean, we're not in a position to get bogged down on details at this point. You know, we're a little far from that. But you know, when you look at when someone calls in your radio show and asks you about some Trump policy, I mean, it's forcing you to accept a framework that you don't accept. And it's forcing you to view the issue or the question, you're not setting the terms of the debate. And that's what we got to do. And you know, the digital age is just unbelievable. We have a platform now that, you know, it's just unbelievable. Compared to 30 years ago, the New York Times had some op-ed, some ridiculous op-ed, and then maybe if you really got worked up about it, you wrote a physical letter to the editor and mailed it in, and then maybe they printed it. I mean, come on, now we have the leveling effect for libertarians. I mean, you know, somebody running for office as a libertarian now can hit send or post something on Facebook, boom, they just reach 60,000 people. Whereas before they had to go door to door with printed leaflets or something like that. I mean, we have to be guerrilla warfare. And the internet has reduced the entry costs for having a voice in the game so dramatically. It's a beautiful thing. So we're living in a great time as libertarians. Murray Rothbard used to say in the 60s and 70s that all the libertarians he knew could fit in his living room. And he lived in a crappy little apartment on the Upper East Side of New York City. The living room was probably, you know. So,
Like the Bolsheviks.
yes, yeah. So we don't know how good we got it.
Okay, we are at a good time to wrap this up. Please, guys, stay, eat, drink. We have a minimum spend. We have to meet at this location. Eat, drink, enjoy yourselves. Jeff's going to stick around and have conversations. If you guys are interested in continuing to be involved with America's Future Foundation, we would love that. On Facebook, pull out your smartphone, go to Facebook, look up America's Future Foundation. The national organization sends out information about both this chapter and other chapters throughout the nation. We'd love it if you were involved locally, or if you travel, drop in and visit the DC chapter, the LA chapter, wherever you happen to go. There are some freebies to grab, both from us and from the Mises Institute, including an awesome Rothbard pen. If you haven't read Rothbard, highly recommend. So yeah, stick around, eat, drink, enjoy Jeff, enjoy each other. Y'all have fun.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you.